Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about 13 Witches, Book 1, The Memory Thief by Jodi Lynn Andreson. So this is a book that I absolutely loved conceptually, but I did not enjoy the process of reading it at all. So this is a middle grade fantasy about a young girl named Rosie. Rosie is a very quiet 11-year-old who clings to stories, fairy tales, and her boisterous best friend, Germ, as a way of dealing with the fact that her mother barely remembers she exists. She dreams of having a mother who thinks of her like a gift and looks at her with love in her eyes, but her mother looks at her like an acquaintance she can barely remember the name of. And when Germ suggests that it's time for Rosie to put away childish fairy tales, Rosie burns all the stories she has ever written, and that act somehow wakes up the magic that has been lying dormant in her all along, and suddenly she finds herself surrounded by ghosts and invisible cloud shepherds in a world where the moon goddess watches silently from above, and a secret book reveals that she's the last of a long line of witch hunters. It turns out her mother's inability to remember her is actually a curse left by the Memory Thief, a witch who steals the memories that allows people to build connections to each other. Now Rosie will need to decide, is she brave enough, strong enough, and powerful enough to take on an immortal representation of the darkness in the world to save her mother's memories and maybe to save herself. Okay, so there is so much about the concept of this book that I absolutely love. There are so many beautiful themes about how memories define us, clinging to the past, growing up without leaving parts of ourselves behind, how stories bring light into the world, and how we can shape the world around us, and how good outweighs the evil in the world. And this is a book that you can tell was written with absolutely so much love. You can really feel the author's heart, in particular in the way the mother's lost memories are handled. Like, it really felt like a very powerful allegory for living with a loved one with either depression or dementia. Like, in some scenes it definitely does feel more like an allegory for depression, other scenes more like dementia, and the ending is definitely more depression than dementia, because, spoiler alert, we have a happy ending, and dementia doesn't go away. But the world here is absolutely gorgeous. The pink haze of the beyond, the cloud shepherds, the Memory Thief's moths and her cocoon, all of it was beautiful to picture and so evocative, and especially in those last scenes in the climax, it felt really spooky and serious, and like I would have loved to have seen it all on a screen, either as a movie or a TV show. And all of it had this faintly fairy tale vibe that fits the themes to absolute perfection, but was also unlike anything I've read anywhere else. Like, this did not feel like the same old fairy tales told over again. And a lot of the world building here reminded me of The Girl Who Drank the Moon, which may be my favorite middle grade book I've ever read as an adult. But there was another half of the world building here that to me just didn't work. Because for all of its inventive fairy tale feelings, this book is low fantasy, urban fantasy. It's set in our world, but there's magic that's hidden that only some people know about. And that's fine. I love low urban fantasy. It is one of my preferred genres. I haven't read as much of it recently because I feel like it's just not been as prevalent as it used to be, but it's still one of my favorite genres. But the fairy tale world building felt like it contrasted in a very bad way to the real world feelings. Like, it felt like it clashed. And yeah, I've seen this combination done perfectly. Like, The Dark is Rising is objectively one of my favorite books ever written, and it is, yeah, a sort of mythical style fantasy set in the real world. There are scenes that are in much more real world setting, but I think the reason that book works so well is because the stuff that's in the real world is painted in rather vague terms. Like, it's a soft watercolor, there are not a lot of details there, so it can feel like anyone's life, and it doesn't feel very contemporary. Like, I honestly did not realize when I read that book that it was meant to be contemporary. I pictured it happening in the 19 teens, and it was only like when there were a couple of references that I was like, oh wait, no, this is modern-ish. And that allowed the mythic sort of world building that is in that book to work with what was already there. It felt vague in the same way. Whereas in this one, the real world feels like I'm reading a Judy Blume book, and the fantasy feels like I'm reading a fairy tale. And they feel like they clash. There's a moment when Rosie has gained the ability to see ghosts, and she's been learning about this magic side of the world, and then suddenly she has to go to a school event that was planned beforehand and that was referenced beforehand, and it feels like the fairy tale narrative just stops dead in its tracks to show an episode of That's So Raven or Hannah Montana. And it felt exactly like flipping channels between two completely different TV shows that just happen to feature the same characters. And it comes down to the tone. The prose feels very super fudge, but the world building feels lyrical, whimsical, and full of childlike awe. And it just grated on me. And I'll be honest, I also just hated the prose in general. Everything is over-explained. There'll be like one sort of lightly symbolic explanation followed by a literal example, and then directly stating the thing that has already been explained twice. Over and over and over again. So like Rosie first thinks that her mother has lost the part of her that allows her to love her. Then she gives us 5 examples of like, oh, her mother never buying groceries, never telling her bedtime stories, or leaving loving notes on her lunch boxes. And then will directly state she doesn't remember to do anything for Rosie. And it's like, I know, I got it the first time. And I know this is a middle grade book. This is meant for kids between 8 and 12. That's usually what middle grade is aimed at. But I feel like even 8-year-olds are going to feel talked down to by a lot of this over-explaining. And also stop to explain things that I do think like a normal 8-year-old would absolutely already know. Like there are 3 or 4 times where it stops to say, and a mother should do that for you. And I'm like, no shit, Sherlock! And I get that that was partially just Rosie saying that and reassuring herself, but it just came across as over-explaining over and over again. And it also explains things over and over again that I feel like Rosie should have already known. Like, she will have the same revelation 3 or 4 times, each one getting slightly more and more solid. Like when Germ also gets the ability to see things, the sight. It's so clearly set up that she gets it from her connection to Rosie. Then Homer basically says it must be her connection to Rosie. Then she thinks about how Germ got the powers right as she's finding out how her father got the sight from his connection to her mother. And then she explains that to Germ, and then after all that, she treats it as a huge revelation of, oh, do you think maybe you got the sight from your connection to me? No, actually, it's not even her. Germ explains it to her, and I'm like, how the hell would this girl not know this by this point? Is the girl's brain made of, like, mush? I don't get it. And it's just overall, the book kept having me scream over and over again, oh my god, we know. And like, I feel like this book just lacked all faith in its readers to understand how anything whatsoever works. Which gave the feeling of the book being meant for younger kids than it even is made for. And I know our protagonist here is 11, like that is pretty directly stated, and she's dealing with emotions and changes that feel very specific to pre-pubescence, and most of what she's dealing with isn't going to really connect to kids in the younger half of middle grade. Like, I know it's been a while since I was an 11-year-old, spoiler here, but like, I feel like when I was only 8 or 9, I was not having that feeling of, oh my god, all my friends are growing up and I'm not. Oh, what do I do? That really is that transition into middle school feeling. And so having a book that reads like it's aimed at much younger middle grade kids, but is clearly centered on the troubles of older middle grade, to me rings as a bit of a problem. But also, the conversations in this book just sounded disjointed to the extreme to me. Like, sometimes it felt like Rosie just said something random, Germ said something random, someone else said something equally random, and Rosie says something connected to her previous comment, and then somebody else responds to Germ's statement from 2 lines ago. And it drove me nuts. And sometimes the author avoided this being too obvious, that she clearly is not having connected dialogue, by just not having dialogue at all. There'll be like 1 line of dialogue, a full paragraph explaining, and then we talked about this for a few minutes, and then another line of dialogue. And sure, that's a great trick if you can't get your dialogue to sound right, but it leaves a disconnect between the reader and the characters. On the other side of that, though, sometimes it just felt like the people were just, you know, having 2 completely different conversations at the same time. And the thing is, I have ADHD, and the majority of the people I've ever hung out with in my life also have ADHD, because neurodivergence clumps together. We tend to be friends with each other. But that means I have had plenty of conversations where everyone in the room is having their own separate conversation and are, you know, paying attention to what the other people are saying. They're taking it in, and it might inspire a new thought, but objectively what you're talking about is not what they're talking about. And that's fine. That's a real world thing. But you don't generally want that in books unless you are trying to specifically display that neurodivergence. And at least as far as I could tell, there were no statements that the majority of the characters in this book were ADHD. And on the exact opposite side of that, there's also dozens of moments when characters just magically knew what someone was thinking. Like, the one that really stands out in my mind as a good memory is there's a moment when someone is telling, Rosie basically exposition dump, and is telling her, the witch is stealing your mother's memories. And Rosie says, but, and then we get a paragraph of stuff going on in her head, but she does not say anything except the word but, and then the character responds, no, Rosie, that doesn't mean you can fight the witches. And we, the reader, know, yeah, that does answer the question Rosie was thinking, but she never said the question. So unless every single ghost in this book is psychic and it's not directly stated, a lot of these scenes feel like they don't actually make sense. And then there's the absolutely ham-fisted way some of the themes are tackled. Like, in particular, the themes of growing up and maybe growing apart from your friends. That's a great theme. And, like, this book, I think, did a better job than most I've read of directly tackling that theme and talking about it in a way that isn't just, don't worry, you'll always be friends, that I remember from middle grade books when I was a kid. But each step of each character arc was just directly, explicitly stated in the text. Like, Rosie would directly think, I don't want Germ to grow up. Maybe I have to grow up to keep up with Germ. I don't want Germ to make friends other than me. I don't want Germ to like other people more than me. Maybe it's wrong for me not to want that. Maybe I should make my own friends. Maybe I don't want to do that. And I'm like, oh my god, have you heard of subtlety? Because, like, yeah, middle grade, I get it. Kids can understand subtlety. Trust me when I say kids are going to learn a lot more from your themes if they have to think about what you're saying at all. Like, there's a reason we don't teach math to kids by answering every single question for them and just filling in their homework for them and saying, yeah, you now know math because you saw me add 2 + 2 to get 4. No, you teach them how to do it, you give them the tools, and then you let them do the problems on their own. And this book felt like it was refusing to let the kids do any of the problems on their own. And the way the theme of growing up was also introduced just bothered me so much. Rosie is reading her friend Germ a story that she's written, and it's an insanely childish story. Like, it does not sound like something an 11-year-old would write, but that's besides the point. But Germ asks her if she doesn't think that they're getting too old for fairy tales and happy endings. And the thing is, yes, I agree. A lot of 11-year-olds are beginning to question, like, if they're too old for fairy tales. They're going, should I put away that? Should I put away my dolls? That is really the height of the era of kids being like, oh, am I too old for this? I don't know. And giving up things they love because they feel like they're too old for it. But what's not on that list? Happy endings! I'm sorry, no. Most middle grade kids do want happy endings. There's a reason that I have literally never read a single middle grade book that ends in the violent death of the protagonist. And it's because middle grade kids don't actually think that happy endings are impossible. They don't think they're unrealistic. They don't think they're childish. Yeah, it's one thing if the happy ending is, and then they lived happily ever after. No, they just want a little bit more nuance in their stories. And then there's all that stuff with the eyeliner, because, like, Germ has started wearing eyeliner, and specifically thick black eyeliner, and Rosie is obsessed with it. Every time she sees her friend, she thinks about how much she hates it. And the rare occasions she sees Germ without it, she thinks about how much nicer Germ looks without it. And, like, it's clearly visual proof that Germ's turning into the cool, boy-obsessed teenager while Rosie is still happy being a little girl. And I get it. I get why it was chosen as an emblem for this. But it just felt like Rosie was being the, I'm not like other girls. I'm not one of those pathetic girls who needs attention from boys. And it's always tied to the fact that Germ is beginning to care about being cool. And it all just felt rather icky to me. Like, it felt like our protagonist was judging her friend for exploring different aspects of her personality. And I know this is the beginning of her arc, and the arc is her getting over that and accepting that Germ is growing up and experiencing new things. But it just felt like that arc could have been presented just as well without demonizing traditionally feminine shit as inherently shallow and obsessed with popularity. And I cannot not address the Harry Potter stuff. So this came out in 2021, which seems a little bit late to be choosing to align your book to J.K. Rowling. Like, I get it, there are still people to this day who see absolutely nothing wrong with reading Harry Potter, supporting Harry Potter, and, like, I still do love the books, I just don't talk about it because I don't want to support her. I understand there are a lot of people out there who will see absolutely nothing wrong to Harry Potter references being in a middle grade book. But the thing is, we already knew she was at least slightly problematic all the way back in, like, 2019 at the bare minimal. Like, that's when she started being very open about her problematic nature. And I know it often takes years and years and years for a traditionally published book to make it from manuscript to shelf to be sold. But I feel like somewhere in those years, someone should have raised their hand and be like, hey, this has become a slightly touchy topic. Are you sure you want to include these references? Which means they were a choice. And they're not really a choice I agree with. And not even just because the author is problematic. I also feel like the references are a weight on this book beyond courting controversy. The references are, Rosie carries a Harry Potter branded Lumos flashlight that will become a very important element of the story. But there's also multiple direct Harry Potter quotes. There are repeated mentions that Rosie absolutely loves the books. The Harry Potter characters are called out by name. And in many ways, I get it, because this is a very clear way to align your main character with a very specific, nerdy, but super hopeful, cheerful audience. Like, the Harry Potter kids had a very specific role in society, and if you want to very quickly tell us who your character is, like, 10 years ago, you could just say, they're Harry Potter fans, and we go, yeah, I get it. But I also understand that it's something that most kids are going to get to this day. It's a pretty well-known reference. But there's no guarantee those books will remain classics. Their inclusion could seriously date this book. Because, like, yeah, HB has been around for a while at this point, but not long enough that you can be utterly sure that the next generation of kids are going to know what it is. And, yeah, it's not like the kids are going to be reading the book going, oh my god, this is dated, but the kids are the least likely to have picked up the cultural touchstones of previous generations. So if something does become dated, they are the ones that are going to lose the references the quickest. And you generally want to assume that your book is going to be picked up in a few years. And you generally want to assume that if kids do pick up your book a decade from now, they will still be able to get and understand everything that's happening in the book as well as kids would today. And there's no guarantee that kids in 2034 are going to read this and immediately click on understand what these Harry Potter references are. And so, like, I feel like if you are going to reference another kid's book in your book, it is wiser to reference one that has very thoroughly weathered the test of time. Something like Narnia or A Wrinkle in Time that are well over 50 years old at this point. Those we can be pretty sure people will still keep reading. Now, yeah, they are less well known than Harry Potter, but that's also why when you include references like this, you probably should include enough explanation that even someone who is not culturally versed will get it. Because also, middle grade is an age range that you're going to get a lot of kids who have yet to pay any attention whatsoever to pop culture. And also just the specific choice of having Rosie be a Harry Potter fan and then having the plot revolve around evil witches made me feel like there was just... It felt like there was a plot hole there, in that I just got really annoyed that there was never once a moment when she was like, oh my god, witches are real, like in Harry Potter? Or, I'm not a muggle! Or even a cheeky, she who must not be named kind of reference. None of that appears. Like, how does this child, who is utterly obsessed with Harry Potter, never bring it up once when she's told that witches are real? And the fact that she never once questioned the fact that the witches are inherently evil, when she grew up on books where the witches are the good protagonists, feels really unrealistic. And it's stupid, and it's not something to be too obsessed over. But it just made the inclusion of the Harry Potter references in this book an even bigger flaw to me. So I really, really, really don't know why they kept them in the book. And all this to me is a great example of why you should not use two current touchstones in your book, because they might age poorly, they might disappear from cultural awareness, and different readers will have very different personal reactions to them. So I just generally think it was a horrible choice not to trade out the Lumos flashlight with just a flashlight the character uses to read in her bed after bedtime. Well, she doesn't have a bedtime, but after she turns off the lights. But overall, yeah, this is a book that I absolutely loved the story. I thought the characters were fun, though honestly a little bit flat at times. The themes were great, the world building was wonderful, and everything about the prose annoyed me. I don't want to be an ass about this, but I would love to read a book that is this exact same book, just written by somebody else. Which goes to show that I think it's just a... I'm not the reader for this author kind of problem. So yeah, if the book still sounds good after me ranting about it, if the concept is still interesting to you, maybe check out this book.